Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Future Debate entitled A Robot Stole My Job. My name's Imran Khan. I'm Chief Executive of the British Science Association, and it's my pleasure to be chairing tonight's debate. Sincere apologies if you're expecting Helen Keane. She's fallen ill and couldn't make it tonight, so I'm standing in for her. She's even sent a little note. Dear humans, I'm definitely ill, and I'm not being kidnapped by a robot. That would be absurd. I hope the debate goes well tonight, and that you find that robots are great. Best, Helen. So hopefully that's cleared everything up in terms of why Helen's not here and sharing this. I'm sure we all wish Helen a speedy recovery, as well as we go on with tonight's debate, especially as we're going to be discussing whether or not autonomous technologies are going to be destroying British culture or not. This whole series of events, Future Debates, are supported by the British Science Association. We do them as part of our work to make science a more fundamental part of British culture and society. That's because we want to empower more people, not just scientists, to constructively engage in debates over the future of science and the future of technology, especially what place it's going to have in our lives, our economy, and Britain at large. This particular debate is the finale of a series of over 20 debates we've held around the country on this topic of robots and autonomous systems. And we've actually put together a short animation to tell you a bit more about it. Can we cue the animation, please?
We live in a world where robotic and autonomous systems perform physical tasks and make decisions with minimal human guidance. Where supermarket self-checkouts, manufacturing robots, and unmanned aerial vehicles are a part of our everyday lives. Technology is evolving to take care of the elderly, educate children, and control transport networks. But what impact will this have? Will we lose touch with our human relationships? Will we be at greater risk of cyber attacks? Will unemployment rise as people are replaced by robots? Or will we be freed from repetitive work? How can we as a society make these decisions together to ensure the robots work with us, not against us? It's time to join the debate.
Thank you very much. And I hope that's got your juices flowing for what's going to be an interesting and exciting evening. In a moment, I'm going to be handing over to each of our panellists to give a quick introduction to themselves and to their expertise and what their perspective is on this really fascinating question. Before I do, just a quick reminder to everyone in the room, we are going to be using Twitter tonight. We're going to be using the Future Debates hashtag. If you've got a question or a comment or an observation that you want to put up there for me to see, do send it in. I've got an iPad here. It's going to come up, and the team are going to send over some questions and feedback to the panel. But with that, it's on to the main event. Can you join me in giving a very warm round of applause to Maggie Bowden, Tom Chatfield, Steve Fuller, Anthony Painter, and Judy Wiseman. Now, our quick introductions. Steve.
I'm Steve Fuller. I'm Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick. My background's in history and philosophy of science, but in recent years I've been very much interested in this concept I've called Humanity 2.0, that we're sort of in a crossroads with regard to where the human condition goes in the future. And this business about robots is very integral to that. And in relation to that, I've been very much involved with trying to articulate and in a way normalize transhumanist discourse. And so transhumanism actually sees the possibility of a kind of, in certain aspects of sort of melding the human and the machine into a kind of cyborg existence, and what exactly does that mean, and whether this really does constitute a major break with the way we have been in the past, or whether it's just a continuation of the way we've always been, given the impact that science and technology has had in human culture. And I tend to take the latter view.
Steve, thanks very much.
My name is Tom Chatfield. My background is, I suppose, literature and philosophy and being a great big geek. But I've become very interested in talking about technology's place in people's lives, human-machine interactions. And one of the things I'm slightly obsessed with is the fact that as machines take on more and more of the attributes we used to think of as uniquely human, reason, language, reasoning, pattern identification to an astonishing degree, that challenges us to revise our sense of what it means to be human. I think in some ways it is a revolution in human consciousness or self-consciousness, a little bit akin to the Copernican or Darwinian revolutions, which sort of rocked our sense of our place in the universe. And the question for me is, what does it mean to have richer and better relationships with technology and through technology? Machines achieve more and more astonishing things, but they achieve them through means that are profoundly alien to human minds. They are not like us. They're a very bad metaphor for us. And I think if there is a sort of exciting way forward for me, it is more thoroughly understanding the differences, more thoroughly understanding ourselves, how we are unlike our machines, and how to make the most of our very different capabilities and our revised place in the scheme of things not being a downgrading.
Thank you very much, Tom. Maggie.
My name is Maggie Bowden. I'm a research professor of cognitive science at the University of Sussex. And I've been involved with AI ever since the late 1950s. In fact, I wrote the first book about AI, and I've got another one, a little one, coming out in May, actually. And the reason I'm interested in it is that my basic interest is the human mind. What it is, how it works, how it's different from the brain, all those philosophical questions. And AI, I think, gives us the best concepts for thinking about these issues. But, as Tom said, there are lots and lots of differences, and the interesting thing to me is to see what are the similarities and what are the differences. So it's human beings that I'm mostly interested in, but AI is fascinating in many, many ways in that context.
Interesting. Spotting some themes and some differences already. Judy.
My name's Judy Wiseman. I'm a sociologist of technology. I work at the London School of Economics, and I have for 30 years now been trying to shift the debate about the relationship between technology and social change from one of, optimism and pessimism and, it's all going to be terrible, it's all going to be wonderful. As you can see, I haven't succeeded in the least because we seem to be stuck in exactly this space. And so I'm very happy to be here because I think forums like this are exactly the place to sort of get away from that sort of polarised debate. I've personally been very interested in the relationship between technology and time and the extent to which technology actually saves time or the extent to which technology is a part of us feeling pressed for time. But I also just want to say very quickly that I've been very concerned with my colleagues in the sociology of science and technology studies to shift the debate to one about a concern with the design and development of technology, to have social and political interventions at the design stage and not always be on the back foot, which is that technologies arrive and we then have ethical discussions about how we're going to use them or not, but the technologies have already been sort of instantiated. So that's where I'm trying to shift the debate.
Interesting. I'll be interested to learn what you think is driving the design if it's not human need at the moment. And finally...
my name is Anthony Painter. I'm Director of Policy and Strategy at the Royal Society of Art. I'm not a scientist, unless you regard political science to be a science, but we'll leave that debate for another day, perhaps. What we're interested in is how we can spread human creativity that is intrinsic to our humanity. We're interested in the big changes that we're seeing in society, including the technological changes that we're seeing, and how we have to adapt our political and social institutions to those changes, whether those are welfare institutions, educational, economic, whatever it may be. We advocate a basic income, but much more besides, and we can get onto that later on in the debate.
Interesting. So if you haven't made the link between a basic income and robots controlling our future, hopefully we're going to get into that because it's a really fascinating area. So that's your panel. They're hugely expert, they're hugely experienced. They've got a huge number of really interesting things to say on the future of robotics and what that means for our society, particularly when it comes to AI doing the kind of things we normally used to do for ourselves. And we're going to be exploring a few different themes with them this evening. The first of them, and hopefully something going to be dictated by you actually, but the first of them we thought we'd get into is that of employment and education. And you'll remember when you signed up for this event, we asked you a number of questions. And one of the things that really came out as a key area of concern was if more and more of the stuff that we need in our society is being done by robots and AI, what kind of things do we actually need to teach people? What do we need to learn in schools? And that's where I wanted to start with my first question to the panel. Given the impact that technology is going to have in the workplace over the next decade, what skills do we actually need to be teaching kids in schools? Is it a continuation of where we've been so far? I mean, is what we've got so far even appropriate? What's going to equip them for a future where the workplace is filled with autonomous systems and robots? Judy, would you like to take that?
Well, I don't actually believe the first premise, so,
Challenge the premise.
There's many things I can say about this. I mean, this is not a new discussion. We've been having this discussion for so long about, that we need to have more creative education and flexible education, all these things so people can be creative, whatever. I mean, I don't know why we're in this period now where daily we read that robots are going to take all our jobs. It seems to me that the evidence is rather scant for this. It seems to me that historically automation creates jobs as well as destroys jobs, and that actually the problem at the moment is the polarisation of jobs, that we have got a lot of people working very long hours and lots of people not working, have got not enough work, and that we could be having a very different discussion about redistributing work and the conditions of work and things like that, rather than this fearful business about robots taking jobs. We've got a huge service sector, and I don't actually believe that much of it will be automated, or that new jobs won't be created as has been the case historically.
But will they be created at the same rate as they're being replaced? Or will we have a potential gap that still needs a policy response?
Absolutely, we need a policy response, but I think the way in which this is viewed, I mean, I actually think the reason we're having this discussion is that it's middle-class jobs, and that the middle classes are very concerned about their own jobs, and when there was massive automation of manual jobs, there wasn't the same concern by journalists and everyone else about this issue, so I think we need to at least have that lens on the discussion.
Is anyone on the panel more concerned than Judy about the future of jobs?
Well, I think there is a real issue here, but it kind of happens at many different levels. First of all, in terms of what we teach kids at school, I'm actually one of these people who thinks that there might be something to the idea of teaching them how to code. Because regardless of what we're talking about in terms of the actual work that people do, there is the fact that most of the information that we're getting and most of our interaction is mediated by computers that are being designed by people who we don't actually know what the basis for the design is, because we don't actually understand how coding works. And so insofar as an increasing amount of the infrastructure of the world is designed this way, from the standpoint of what would count as basic literacy in the 21st century alongside of numeracy and literacy in the conventional sense would be something like computer literacy, kind of coding. So I do think that that's kind of an important thing at the educational level. How that's actually framed is an open question, because I think in a sense at the moment it's a bit too mechanically presented, you might say. So in other words, maybe the students don't quite learn what's the import of actually learning how to do this, other than they might be able to get a job as a coder, okay? But that's not really the spirit in which this should be done. It should be seen as really trying to understand the infrastructure of their world more. Now, with regard to taking away jobs, and maybe I have a somewhat different slant on this from Judy, I actually think that a lot of traditional professional work involving clinical judgment and legal practice and things of that kind, where there's an enormous amount of human beings working at the moment, making quite a lot of money very often, I think those jobs are kind of under threat. And the reason why they're under threat is because it's a kind of a byproduct of not only any developments in artificial intelligence, but also the increasing accountability culture that we live in, where people have to make much more explicit why they're doing things and how they're doing things, and there's greater and greater ways of tracking what people are doing. And so the more of a kind of data trail that there is for professional practice as part of this audit culture in which we live, the easier it then becomes to simulate what counts as competent practice. Okay? And so I do think there is this kind of synergy going on between whatever developments are taking place in artificial intelligence and the increase in the audit culture and the amount of surveillance that this in fact opens us to as part of our normal operating procedure with regard to employment.
And do you think we're equipping young people to deal with that?
No, I think we need to. I mean, the point is, I think we need to, and I actually think it wouldn't help if some middle-aged people picked up on this too, frankly. It's not just, this is not just, in a sense, this is an ongoing problem now, right? We're not talking about something that's just going to happen in the future, but in a sense, we're already laying the groundwork for this.
Great. Okay, reactions from the audience. Is anyone seeing their livelihood being eaten away by a metallic robot as we speak? We've got a question over there.
I'm Daniela Duca. Question. we didn't define robots. I mean, washing machines and dishwashers also took some jobs away, and copying machines and so on. What about that?
Oh, thank you so much for that, I'm not sure that how many jobs they took away. I mean, I think what's interesting about those domestic technologies is that they change the task, right? And that we think about technologies as simply saving time, whereas actually we do much more laundry because we wash clothes much more often. We buy, silk and synthetics and very different things. We do light and coloured watches. Our standards of cleanliness have risen out of all proportion to how it was before we had washing machines, for example. So I think it's very important when we talk about and think about technologies, we're always talking about the technologies changing ways of life, changing things and adding things as well as taking things away. And I think even in terms of the job discussion, I think there's lots of there'll be, actually if you look at the number of lawyers there were 30 years ago when people talked about the automation of legal work, and you look at the number of lawyers now, actually there isn't good evidence for the fact that there are less lawyers. In fact,
I was going to leap in with a quick comment. I think one of the interesting things to me is that when we're talking about washing machines and sort of robots out there in the world, we're talking about the way that we sort of construct special environments in which machines can perform physical tasks, factories in which we sort of adopt new habits. But more and more of the work that certainly happens in the world's sort of biggest and most advanced economies is information work. And I think one of the differences here is that we are in the domain of the machines in what we're doing anyway. I don't mean that in a sinister or apocalyptic way, but I mean that we are working in the stuff of information. And in fact, much of the work that we do involves translating our ends and objectives into sort of scalable data processing terms. And when it comes to skills, I am quite optimistic. But I'm optimistic in the sense that, the vast global infrastructures of technology we're building, one of the most significant things they do is connect millions of the most powerful and flexible computing devices in the universe, our brains, the brains of humans. And it's very clear that there is less and less in this complicated world we live in that we can accomplish individually. But more and more we can accomplish together. Code itself, broadly speaking, is an unending process of collaboration, forking, and iteration. And this kind of logic of collaborative iteration is pertaining to more and more industries. And the skills that support that are the skills of systems thinking, are the skills of understanding computational thinking, but they're also skills like empathy and being able to express yourself clearly. I work with a lot of tech firms, and of course they want powerful computational thinkers, but they also increasingly seem to want empathetic people who are good co-workers. Now, these people are often known in the shorthand as women. And there is an argument, which I rather like, although I don't know if it's entirely scientific, that basically men are becoming less and less fit for purpose because the narrow, slightly unempathetic stuff we're terribly good at, machines can do anyway. But combining that with being able to hold a conversation is a skill that, for a variety of complicated biological and sociological reasons, perhaps women at the moment are rather better at than us.
But can I just interrupt here? Because isn't it curious then that there are so few women engineers and computer scientists,
Absolutely.
that we've been saying this for 30 years, that we know how important it is to be sensitive to users, and yet actually the number of women engineers working in Britain at the moment is 6%?
Yes, I mean, it's beyond
so can
curious.
we just keep saying this, or do we need to do something about this?
We've had a great question and comment coming in from Twitter, actually, from Manish. He points out that what if coding actually gets automated to a large degree as well? And actually, we've seen that to some extent with stuff like web design, where if you wind back 10 or 15 years, web design was incredibly complex and technical, and now anyone can do it. What if the same thing happens with the way you code programs, the way you code robots to do work as well? Are we at risk of just setting up another skill that will get rapidly obsolete as systems for automation get better? Anthony, I saw you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, we have this sort of neurotic debate about education in this country, and it's sort of framed around sort of knowledge versus skills, and we're kind of stuck in this dynamic between a sort of traditionalists and the more creatives or progressives, if you like, and it's kind of tedious because both is the essence of it. And I think Tom's right. Ultimately, the additional skills that we'll need to a greater extent, or the workforce of the future will need, is the ability to interface with intelligent machines. And those intelligent machines are computers, robots, whatever they may be, and they're also each other. And I think that's absolutely essential. The ability to interface with each other as intelligent machines is going to be critical to the education of the future. So that's kind of, we've got to get out of this rut of the education debate on that front. Now, on the jobs and automation front, I think it's exactly right. We've had this debate not just in the last 30 years, the last 200 years, the last 250 years. And there's two things that happens in this debate. One, those who predict that there is going to be a decimation of employment in aggregate generally are wrong. Normally, new types of jobs come to the fore, and new jobs replace old jobs. But there is a transition. And there are particular groups who lose out in the transition. And this transition can last a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. And we're talking about sometimes entire working lives of people who are disenfranchised in the labour market and have an enormous struggle. And it would be good to think in our public debate that we can think about that transition. I think it's exactly right. The fact that the sort of more professional, middle-class, routine jobs are under threat is creating some of the noise around thinking about actually how we have to adapt. But it is a conversation we have to have, and maybe we can do it better this time, because there is a need for some social technology as well as digital technology.
Can I ask you a
and
question
social
about
technology.
this? Because this
I'm
sounds
going
wonderful.
to hold that for a second.
Sorry,
Go back to
okay.
the audience for some more questions. Go on.
The social technology is the institutions we have to support people in how they can create their lives and replicate their lives, and that's critical too. And that's slower.
Can we have some more questions? Is anyone prompted by any of those thoughts? Got one gentleman over there, and while the microphone's making its way over, I do worry you're being a bit optimistic, Judy, because I look at something like the automation of transport, where if we do get fully driverless cars in the UK, we'll have every lorry driver, every cab driver, every Uber driver, every tube driver potentially, obsolete within a period of a few years. And while that will potentially create more jobs in the future, it's a very quick transition to have to get over in a period of a few years, as Anthony's saying.
I mean, I'm not convinced it will be that quick. There's quite a few people in the audience, actually, who know a lot more about this technically than me.
But let's invite them in a minute.
That we can invite them in.
Okay.
But my sense is with a lot of, companies that produce technologies, they tell us for decades that we're on the cusp, of where we're going. It seems to me it's a long way off, actually.
Okay. So.
What I noticed is that there's, although there's a number of different perspectives, there's essentially a theme emerging here that the elimination of jobs is a bad thing, the creation of new jobs is a good thing. Will these new jobs compensate for the old jobs? Yes, no. I would suggest that we need to move beyond this idea and recognise that the elimination of jobs entirely could be a positive thing if the labour saving and productivity gains can be distributed across the population rather than kept amongst a very small class. And I'm aware that there are all sorts of institutional and economic barriers to that. But if that could be addressed, as I say, I think we need to move beyond this idea that new jobs, retaining jobs, is an intrinsic good.
Maggie, less work a good thing?
I think it's a very good thing. And I think when in terms of, teaching children and older people skills and coding and so forth, yes, it's very important. But part of the reason why it's important is that they get a sense not just of what these things can do and how, but very importantly, what they can't do. And I think it's very important, that if you're in a situation, whether it's you're a lawyer or you're a doctor or whatever you are, where your work environment is being affected by these things, you need to have a good sense of what is it that they can and can't do at the particular time, today, right? And that human beings have to be asked to do. And you also hopefully have to have a good sense of what it's reasonable to suggest that they might be able to do tomorrow or that they might not be able to do tomorrow. And one of the things which I think is troubling here is that if all of the relatively routine tasks are taken in these middle-class jobs are taken over by expert systems, if you like, by AI, where are we going to get? How can we train the new generation, the future generations of top-level human managers, to whom we can take the really difficult problems. Because people always say, well, let the computer work out the boring problems, let them do that, and the difficult ones give to a human being to sort out. Well, yes, but how are they going to learn that if all of the problems that can be computerized are computerized and there is less sort of human interaction and human understanding in the workplace working with these things? I think there are some very deep issues there.
Steve, how do you get good stewardship of these autonomous systems?
Well, I don't know if that's the question, actually. I think what Maggie's raising is a very interesting point, namely, see, I'm not one of these people who believes that there is an essence of humanity. It's always been a kind of floating signifier, you might say. And there's a sense in which, as we introduce all these new machines, we're going to have to redefine what it means to be human as against all of these things that these machines are increasingly able to do, which in the past did define our humanity. Okay? And so that's going to be a pretty tough thing. And so, generally speaking, we might want to use a kind of placeholder for something like creativity or something like that as kind of the refugee concept of the human that keeps on escaping, right? That keeps on escaping from whatever the artificial intelligence can do at a given moment. And I think that's kind of, in a way, the most helpful way to think about this. So I don't make any a priori pronouncements, unlike my pal over here, who, about there's just certain things that these machines will never be able to do because they're intrinsically human. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, what's going to happen is that what it means to be intrinsically human will change, right? So it'll escape, right? And so the thing is, if we have this discussion 50 years from now, it'll be a different kind of boundary being set. And I think I think what's the more important question at a practical level is the thing that was being raised at the other end of the table, which is this business about transitioning to a new set of jobs. And what are these jobs going to look like? What are going to be these human-only jobs of the future, right? Because this seems to me at the great promissory note that's being launched on the other side. Because if you're anticipating that these middle-class jobs are going to be taken away within the next generation, it is not too early to already have a policy for re-educating, for retraining, for coming up with some kind of appropriate scheme so that you actually have it all set up so people can enter into these new jobs, whatever these new jobs are. And I want to know what these new jobs are, right? Because it doesn't make sense to be training people to go into some other new world unless you have some sense of what they are. And that's why I'd like our friend on the other side of the table to maybe come a little cleaner on this, because he gave us a great, kind of exhortative speech, but I'm not sure what those other jobs are.
Let's go there in a minute. Before we do, can I see some more hands so the microphone can make its way while we're having an answer? Anthony, what's your response to a cast iron job that a robot definitely can't take?
Well, I think robots and intelligence may affect all work, actually, and we're working all of us are working on some level alongside computers. The jobs of the future are going to look generally like the jobs of now, but they will be formed very differently. The categories will still demand very similar things in a generation's time. We're not going to see a complete transformation of the economy in 20 years. What we're going to see is something happening much slower. And there will be a period to adapt. I don't think we need to say, right, okay, this is the way jobs market's going to look in 20 years' time, and now we have to train people to do those jobs. Because the reality is you can't take that view. And what's really interesting, you look at sort of reports about jobs predictions in the 2000s and so on. They were talking about there'll be no low-skill jobs in the 2020s. People have to train out because otherwise they're going to be locked in a portion of the job market where there's going to be no growth. Well, that's the part of the job market where there is some growth, actually. So I don't think we need to start making sort of big predict and provide style predictions. What you need to do is put in place things that enable people to access the learning they might need. And people need to be aware, and the big worry is a portion of people that don't realise they may need to access new learning and new skills. And that's the public discussion we should be having, because we are making a promise to people that we can't fulfil.
And what are those systems? What are those things you want to put in place?
They are systems of peer-to-peer learning. They are accessing new types of skills in the workplace, mature apprenticeships, whatever it may be. But the point is that people have to direct their own way through this with support of public investment. It can't be a matter of saying, we're going to provide this and people will go, they'll get the training, they'll get the jobs. That's just not going to work.
Okay.
Can I add something?
Please do.
I couldn't disagree more with my colleague over
Excellent.
here. Of course, I don't think we're going to be redefining what's human. I have to say that the longer I live and the more I read, the more the continuity of history strikes me rather than discontinuity. When I read about sociologists from 1900 discussing human dilemmas, they seem very familiar to me. And I would like to just posit the fact that we're actually, we have a crisis of care. You know, our hospitals are full of old people. There's nowhere for them to go. There's going to be a lot more old people. And it's a very good segue to a discussion that some of us are having already about caring robots. And I, for one, think that robots will be able to do some things for old people, but there's an awful lot of things they won't be able to do. And as I'm getting older, I am rather concerned about some of the surveys that you have about one of them that really struck me was that people seem happier to have old people looked after robots than sex workers. And I just think, well, you know.
So was that old people looked after by sex workers?
No, but I mean the value.
It's a transition.
That's a good transition. There is something about how you know, the valuing of old people. You know, what is it, you know, how are we devaluing old people if we think about them in terms of, well, let's have a robotic seal or other things that will keep them, entertained and things of that sort. So I think there are a lot of things that we could be doing, and it is a political issue about what sort of work we value and what sort of work we need to revalue in a better society. And those issues are political issues, not technical issues.
Yeah. Question right in the corner there.
I actually have the same question as Steve had and want to come back. These new jobs that are supposed to appear soon and save us from this crisis, I wish I shared the optimism. I'm just struggling to find any job that will appear in the future that will be caused by this technological change, because I see a lot of movement the other way. I mean, we can see public transport workers being replaced by automated cars. Truck industry in the United States, which I think is the largest employer for low-skilled males, is likely to disappear because those trucks are going to drive themselves. They're already there. It's not something that's being imagined. As you were mentioning, in medical care, a lot of this low-end caring work could be done by robots, and I would actually prefer to be cared by a robot, to be honest. And if you think, maybe I'll change my mind later, but for now I feel like that. So if you could just share your optimism and convince me and the rest of the audience that some positive changes are going to come our way, because I'm struggling to see those new jobs.
Well, I'm going to try and segue that question with a new area for our conversation tonight as well, which is the limits of AI and what can humans do which AI can't, and what does that create as an opportunity. And we've already covered some areas. Sex work and care for the elderly is two areas which we might want to restrict for humans, but that's open for debate. So, you know, we have got some data on this. Apparently 22% of men believe that robots can be trusted as sex workers, but only 13% of women do. Anyone surprised by that? 36% of people believe that artificial intelligence could be trusted with looking after the elderly, but 38%, so slightly more people, feel like they can't. There's a big number of people who are undecided there. So perhaps that's a question for the audience. You know, who would like to take up the challenge from the corner of saying there are just going to be some jobs which are going to grow in nature as we have more autonomy? Got a response over there, gentleman in the blue jumper.
Hi there. In my area of work, I would like actually to provide a counterexample to everyone who's so worried about middle class jobs being lost. So my remit is I'm actually in charge of the old school BT payphones that are all around the country. And currently in my team there are 7 people, and we call them payphone engineers. But essentially, I hope they're not listening. But what they do is they go around and they basically clean these phones to make sure that the glass doesn't hurt anyone or anything like that. But we're looking into the future now, and we're going to replace these with nice digital units, with Wi-Fi, with USB charging points, with mobile small cells in there. And we expect that this transition into a modern day technology will employ 600 British people. And that's in middle class jobs. We're talking designers, engineers, we're talking people who are internet experts, we're talking mobile data, things like that. And that's the counterexample I'd like to potentially provide an answer to the young lady over there, and also provide a thing that jobs are being created from technology. We may be losing some, and actually we're losing what we would call the lower class. Well, in this case, and there may be other instances. I don't know if this is unique or not. I'm just providing an example from my area of work. And also, I would like to pick up on that question, that segue question, because we've talked, and it was, I think it was Tom who said that, talking about the brain as the most advanced supercomputer on the planet. Now, there is that age-old sci-fi question: can computers replicate humanity? And we don't know that in time they wouldn't be able to be creative. Is there a refuge for humanity? Is there a refuge for the human mind? If robots are becoming so advanced that there is a potential that they would be indistinguishable in the future from ourselves in terms of what they can do. And that's a question that I think the point was raised earlier. There's a difference between the human brain and the human mind. And I'd just like to pick up on that question and ask exactly what that means.
And if that happened, would be a problem?
I would want to say the human mind is what the human brain does. And put it in terms that a computer scientist might use, I would say the mind is the set of virtual machines, or information processing systems, if you like, which generate all of our psychological phenomena and which are implemented in the brain. But they are, as you said, they're vastly more diverse, vastly more powerful, vastly more subtle than anything we can do in AI at the moment. I'm not saying it's in principle impossible to have an AI which would equal or even surpass human intelligence. I think it's in principle possible, partly because of the defined mind in the way that I just did. But actually getting there is quite another matter. And let me give an example in terms of this caring. This issue of caring old people and so forth worries me very, very much. Now, there's certain aspects of it which I have no problems with. If the thing is going to, remind the old person, have you taken your pills today? Or it's 7 o'clock, or 7:30, do you want to watch EastEnders? That sort of thing. No problems. It could be no problems at all with that. Very useful. But some of the people doing this research say that they're going to be able to have comforting, emotionally rich conversations with the old person, as a human being could if they had time. And of course, the people working in these homes don't have the time.
But would that bother you if it was a genuine intelligence that was on a human level?
Well, you see, I don't think it's possible. Well, as I said, I think it's impossible. It's possible in principle, but the difficulties are so great. I absolutely don't see it happening with this century. Just, the use of natural language that assumes. I don't think that will be possible in this century, and I wouldn't actually be surprised if it never happens.
Why don't you put it to the test of old people? In other words, see whether the old people actually think that these machines are providing some kind of comfort. We don't have to speculate about it. They may actually work in practice.
Well, the little baby seal thing,
we've all seen those.
Yeah, that does work, and it does. I have no problems with that sort of thing. It's when they're having conversations, touching on personal, emotionally fraught issues. Suppose the old lady says, the thing picks up perhaps that she's sad today, because they can do that. They can pick that up. And it says, Mrs. Smith, you seem to be a bit not yourself today. What's the problem? Is there a problem? And she says, yes, it's the anniversary of my only child's death. He was killed in a road accident 40 years ago. Then what's the thing going to say?
So we appear to be drawing this line in the sand around the very personal, whether that's emotional or whether that's bodily. There does seem to be this concern that we all have. We've got a couple of gents in the front row who are absolutely desperate to get in. I feel like they're going to explode if I don't let them talk. Go for it.
I'm Tony Prescott. I'm the director of Sheffield Robotics, which is a large robotics research institute. So I do have an angle on this. And I co-develop with my colleague here, Sebastian Conran, assistive and companion robots. So I have a view on this as well.
I think stock interest too.
It's an observation that I talk to people, and we develop collaborative projects with people who are in the field of care. And they tell me, and I think this is a true observation that you'll see in many places that offer residential care, that the human carers find it quite hard to have the kinds of conversations you're imagining with the people that are being cared for. And actually they get neglected. And they might not have anybody to discuss the fact that they are sad about the death of their relative.
Yeah.
And their own relatives might not visit them very regularly.
Absolutely.
And these people are rushing around doing physical care for them.
Absolutely.
So there is the possibility that the robot, although it may not understand them at a human level, it can understand them on some level. And I think if it can provide some comfort, and if you look at the success of, for example, pet therapy in caring for older people. So you bring a pet dog around to an old people's home, and that gives people a lot of reassurance, and it improves their feeling of security. And we have similar results when we bring companion robots to people.
And
so
Toby,
we don't
do
have to have...
Do you think there should be any limits then, or should or are there any limits to what these companion robots or AI can or should do?
I don't think we should try to set limits now. And we shouldn't, as people who are not yet in that situation of being alone and uncared for, try and answer for them whether or not they would like to enjoy the companion of a robot. I mean, you can enjoy the companionship of Radio 4 without imagining that it's understanding you. You can watch a movie and you can have an emotional response to it without believing that there's an emotional response to your emotional response. So all of these things that sort of can happen with a robot. It can be engaging in a different way to a human or an animal, but equally it can provide you with some emotional support.
Well, I mean, in principle, that's true. And, of course, the better the natural language is, that's true. But I think that a pet is very different. A pet is something which shares a form of life with us. I mean, I know Wittgenstein said if a lion could talk, we wouldn't understand him. Well, we wouldn't fully understand him because he's so different. On the other hand, there's lots of things that lion might say which we could resonate to because, you know, we get tired, we get bored, we get hungry, etc., etc., etc. How are you going to have a conversation like that with one of these things?
We might well find out one day. Got another question over there.
All right. So I'm running the risk of this being controversial, but we sort of assume that the robot has to understand, but does it have to understand? If we look at, stereotypically at psychologists, they ask very simple questions. So if I was somebody who wants to design a robot to care or to have a conversation with a person, I would look at the type of questions that you need to ask, because in the end, the human mind is going to solve its own problem if it talks about it. And I think there is research that shows you do become closer with a person if you actually share what your problem is rather than listening to what the other person says. And we already have robots that can understand the emotions that you have, you know, happy, sad, and so on. So it could start from there.
Tom, I think I've caught you grinning at that comment about stereotypical psychologists.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. We go back to the original chatbot, Eliza, and its creator, in fact, ended up being rather appalled by the degree to which very, very simple questions elicited immense feelings of projection and empathy from people. People are sometimes alarmingly stupid, or at least...
Oh, is that how you diagnose it?
At least we don't... It's very dangerous drawing lines in the sand. I think I wouldn't like to say I was making a priori assumptions about human nature. I think it's more that we are having to revise what we are. And I think we are searching for generalizations where generalizations might not be possible, that it is in some ways much more challenging to try and ask what is in front of our noses right now with this, for example, therapeutic practice around robots. And we find ourselves in the uncomfortable position that, you know, we find things that make us feel better, that are deeply satisfying or rewarding to us, which are not in some, you know, sort of profound sense, that's what we think we ought to want, what is kind of the right thing. And I think, you know, it is very dangerous. It's very dangerous indeed to sort of stake out with your little picket fence, here is the sort of uniquely human. You know, creativity, I mean, you look at the South Korean commentaries on AlphaGo, and what a lot of people there found very shocking is that it made beautiful moves, that it was astonishingly, enigmatically creative in its artistry. I think move 39 in one of the games was considered dazzling. Now, ultimately, what's the judge of something beautiful or not? Well, it's people perceiving it as such. Who are we to say that these people are morons? But I don't feel despairing about this, because I think, in a sense, there is this ongoing business of trying to be honest about what real people are doing and feeling in real situations, and where and when not systems and tools we build are helping us or proving powerful, we will find plenty of surprises there. We will learn to understand ourselves differently. But we have these sort of mythic narrations of usurpation and seduction going on. And to some degree, ask a psychoanalyst and they'll say this says a lot about the patient and very little about the subject, so to speak. We're kind of projecting onto our machines a lot of anxieties that really perhaps prevent us from seeing what is in front of our noses.
I want to bring my panellists on this end of the table in, because I think something that this question gets to the heart of is, do we have an overinflated sense of ourselves in some ways? The fact that clearly we do get a lot out of whether it's petting a seal, whether it's talking to a chatbot, does it show that actually we're not as all that as we think we are, and that robots might be close to what we need than we think they might be?
I'm sure that's the case, but equally, we've got to ask. I don't sort of reject anything that's been said about the importance of these types of comforting tools, therapeutic tools, whatever you may want to call them. And if they have a role to play, that's great. But we're letting ourselves off the hook a bit here, because human relationships are entirely precious and important, not just, for example, for our elderly relatives, but for us as well. And that's a precious thing that I don't think we can afford just to allow ourselves to sort of slowly step away from, which might be the implications of contracting it out to intelligent machines, devices, whatever it may be. And I think we've got to challenge ourselves a bit more and say, actually, in the type of society we're going into, in an ageing society where there are these tools, we've got to challenge ourselves to a greater extent to engage in a human way, because that is something we value and is important. It's nothing to do with the robots, it's to do with us and our society and what's good for us.
Just to be argumentative there, perhaps there are some people that don't feel that's that important to them and they're happy to forego human relationships if they can get to robots.
I've absolutely no doubt that's the case, but I think we still as society have got to push back and cherish what's important in human relationships.
What about computer-mediated human relationships, as an increasing amount of human relationships are? Is that a problem as far as you're concerned?
I'm not saying any of it's a problem. I'm saying that if we allow ourselves to break very precious bonds just through neglect, then that's a problem.
We've got a question over here. While the microphone's making its way over, I'm going to bring in Judy on that question.
Well, I was just going to say, I do think that in this society where that's very polarised in terms of the overworked and the underworked, what we're seeing is more and more sort of apps, whatever it is, TaskRabbit, whatever it is, where people are contracting out, if you like, more and more of their labour, their cooking labour, their caring labour, all kinds of labour. And do we want that Silicon Valley model where you're in Google, you live in there, you work 24/7, and you use your app to organise everything else around you? That is a society that only very few people, believe you me, we're not all going to be living those conditions ever.
So your point is it's very transactional as opposed to...
Well, I think we have to actually the early women's movement, thought that we should actually clean after ourselves, that we actually thought it wasn't a good thing to have other people cleaning for us, that we should clean our own mess. We could have a discussion about how we live, how we daily relate to people if we want to have a service economy where rich people have got a lot of people servicing their every need, which is what we're heading towards. And caring is just one example of subcontracting out the work.
We had a great comment on Twitter. If robots genuinely did develop true human intelligence, might they decide they didn't want to do this kind of work after all?
That's what this gentleman was getting at.
If only Asimov was here. Question over there.
Kind of a comment, really, as well as a question, but on this question of comfort. There is a question there that, whether robots in some ways could replace human comfort, or whether they have a different function, like cuddling a soft toy or whatever. There's something comforting, but there are different types of comfort, different levels of support or companionship. And what sprung to mind really during that discussion was something that Maggie said, this question of what they can and can't do. And kind of struggling for something that, is there something that they can't do if they could theoretically offer the same understanding at some stage, whether that's in the next century or not? For me, it's a kind of question of what you get from a kind of connection with a human being, what you get as a kind of comfort is quite different. There's a comfort from being able to talk and express your own kind of views and resolve your own problems, and maybe that is resolved in some ways if a robot can respond, it can understand your emotions and prompt you. But there is, again, I think, a different kind of comfort in that if you are speaking to a human being, you have this potential for a fuller understanding, the sense not just that they can respond, that they can let you talk, but maybe they're really going to understand what you're saying, they're going to care, they're going to kind of, whether or not they can express that or you gain anything in a kind of additional physical sense or whatever from that, there's something I think that maybe a robot could provide the same level of comfort if you accept that you will never have that full potential of understanding and kind of emotional response.
So you're in the camp that there's always going to be qualitative difference, but it might not matter.
If you choose to accept, in my view, that you will not have quite that same level, or you're happier with talking in the open and just resolving your own issues, maybe. I don't know. I think, for me at least, there is a kind of fuller potential of understanding and companionship from a human being than I can imagine at least a robot being able to provide.
So, Maggie, would you be happy with a society where that was some people indulge in that and were happy to do it, or would you want us to have a social norm where it's accepted that kind of companionship shouldn't be allowed because it's, denigrates the importance of human relationships?
I think it's generally difficult. What I really would like is to have, and I think this is what you were saying, Anthony, is to have a society, a culture in which we cherish our own human relationships and we cherish our elderly people, whether they're our relatives or our friends or not. I mean, because sometimes they're not going to be, of course. And where these sorts of things certainly aren't taking over, they aren't needed to take over because there is enough genuine human interaction going on. And if they're not taking over, then I'm not so worried about it, because if the person isn't deceived, if the person is just using them as, an entertaining toy, which they most certainly could be, I have no problems with that. It's if the person is being somehow deceived, and don't forget, they may be slightly demented already, these people, right? And if they think that they're having a genuine human relationship, and actually all they're doing is talking to a gizmo, and not actually, in many cases, getting, I would say, the sort of response from this gizmo which really would be emotionally appropriate at that moment, I think that's very, very worrying, and I think
Steve,
that
you
we
look
should
very
be
concerned
ashamed of ourselves if we let that happen.
I think we shouldn't get too nostalgic about human relationships, okay? I do think we're really kind of egging the pudding here about, just how interested we are in having this deep understanding of other people and all this. This is actually pretty exceptional, I think, in terms of human beings' interaction with other human beings.
Perhaps you should speak for yourself.
I'm sorry, I don't believe you. I don't believe you, frankly. I don't believe you. And in fact, this is one of the things that actually, the fact that what I'm saying is true actually is what has allowed the amount of computer mediation to take place with regard to human relations already in a very kind of slippery slope style fashion, which ends up getting people like Susan Greenfield thinking, we're going to the dogs with computers. Okay, so the point is that there never was this very hard distinction. I mean, there are these exceptional cases that you were talking about, but they're not necessarily the norm, and there's lots of ways of substituting, replacing, or simulating it. And this is the situation where you can get pets and you can have machines and so forth, provide that kind of level of comfort, whatever, even a certain kind of understanding, right, that doesn't require the deep stuff. I mean, I'm not saying the deep stuff isn't valuable, but one shouldn't assume it's somehow universal and we're somehow getting rid of it. It's actually always been pretty rare, And I think the interesting question is, what if we get to a society where you do have a lot of people who are very much concerned about the face-to-face communication and the deep kind of human interaction, and others who are much more satisfied, dealing with it in more mediated ways or with pets or with machines? How do you have a society that's organized with all those people living together and mutually respecting each other, right? And also the other beings that are being brought into the kind of, relations of affect that are taking place, namely the animals and the machines. I think that's the interesting, complicated question, because that's the kind of world we're emerging into.
Very quick one, Tom.
Yeah, I just want to bring up the really rare and exceptional case of about the first 10 years of life of every human being on the Earth, when in these exceptional cases we generally intuit that actually a deep and committed human relationship between newborn children when they're growing and their parents is kind of a big deal. And our intuitions are often faulty. In fact, cognitively speaking, our intuitions are almost invariably faulty, or they're sort of sometimes rather unfortunate evolutionary heuristics. But I think children are an interesting test. I have a little robot babysitter called CBeebies at home, which is very effective. I want my children to be fluent in technology. In a sense, I would hope that a gift I can try to give them is some sort of capacity to sort of manage technology and take advantage of its massive opportunities. But I think, when I try and sort of focus in on, I hesitate to say irreducible human stuff, but stuff that is, tremendously important at a profound level, I, look at the tiny children I have at home, and I think, what am I and am I not willing to outsource, and how can this outsourcing and sharing be a great positive rather than a negative or a shirking of duty? And to some degree, I'm interested that demographically speaking, in fact, intergenerational households are becoming more and more of a norm. People don't move out from their parents' homes, so they're in their 30s in the UK now on average for various economic reasons. And I think, at its best, technology does allow us to have more choices and richer choices, and maybe to sort of shed our faulty intuitions, and not to get stuck and nostalgic and wedded to an unreal past. But I do think that we lose sight of, some of the irreducible stuff rather too glibly if we don't think about where life begins as well as where it ends.
So lots of feelings on there are some things that are irreducible and inescapable, but we can't quite agree on what they are. Got a question here at the front and then one at the back as well.
What I really want to focus on is, how we can lead spiritually enriched lives in the new sort of autonomism rather than capitalism or communism that we're going to have. I mean, are we all going to be born redundant? How do we live happy and productive lives? How do we prevent our old people's homes becoming sort of human donkey sanctuaries, which is what actually seems to be happening, because we employ lowest common denominator people to care for them. An inorganic pet or an inorganic companion can actually be far more responsive than a human one. We haven't yet got the paranoid android, but we can have some pretty unpleasant human beings and dogs. And so I don't think we should forget that.
I'm not sure how carers would feel about being called lowest common denominator people, but we'll move on to that one. Got a question at the back there.
I think it's very interesting that a lot of the discussion considers the robots to be beneath us. What do the panel think about a situation where you have humans conducting jobs where they're reporting into robots, or AIs as decision makers kind of above us making policy or making decisions on our behalf, on all our behalves?
Well, I wouldn't design machines like that. I mean, what I've been trying to say is actually I think every day where, other people are making decisions about the sort of technologies they're designing, the sort of algorithms they're designing, and I think we should be participating in that and not having... I think there is a bit of a tendency at the moment to be leaving too many decisions, actually, to a lot of what's the new sort of datafication, big data policy. And we should be reasserting, actually, that we want to think about social and political problems first and technological solutions second. And I wouldn't leave moral, political, social decisions actually to machines. I wouldn't do that.
Can I just pull you up there? Because that implies that we will have some level of mass society, perhaps even global-wide regulation on how AI systems and robots can be designed. And that perhaps is fanciful. Can you actually control the way in which this technology is going to evolve across the world to have that level of control over it?
At the moment, there's quite a discussion in Europe about regulating the algorithms that operate in high-frequency trading. One can have that discussion, say there was a financial crash, the way in which the system was working in terms of automated systems, wasn't for the public good, and that we can have some regulation about how these things are used. We can absolutely do this. And we can actually as well discuss video games and pornography and all sorts of things that we're getting now, and not have them to be designed to be maximally addictive, for example. The fact that we're always going on about, people are so addicted to machines. We talk about this, but we never talk about all the behavioural psychologists, the best in the world, who sit there designing the technologies to be as addictive as possible. It's not a coincidence these things are addictive.
I have to admit that my favourite thing about video games is that they are addictive, but we'll have to come back to that one. Anthony, would you want a computer as a boss? My email account probably is my boss, actually, but how'd that work for you?
Yeah, well, it feels like that pretty much every day. But I think with this, the question is, it's not about being a sort of control freak. We do surrender control over our own lives in a considerable way every day of the week. We get on the tube, and that governs our life, and we're willing to surrender and that control to something else. And I think that's the question, really, and that's the test. Does passing power onto an algorithm, AI, empower us or disempower us ultimately? To protect us? Does it enable us to do things we couldn't otherwise do? But ultimately, do we have some sort of choice in the transaction? And that's where the line is, ultimately. And that's where the social and political conversation comes. What are the regulations, what are the interventions that are going to allow us to have that choice and control over our own destinies?
Can I leap onto that really quickly? I mean, to agree with Anthony and build on that. In a way, the idea that systems can be ethically superior to people is called civilization. Tax, laws. The whole point is that collectively we build up bodies of expertise and practice over time that stop us just punching people in their face when we don't like them, or burning down their houses, or people with big sticks coming in and beating up people with small sticks. And, once we phrase it like that, I find it very useful, and we can say in Anthony's terms, what's a good law and what's a bad law? What's a good justice system and a bad justice system? What is a well-run transport system and an underfunded mess? And, this is perhaps a more practical way. We already have plenty of people working for systems. If you've ever eaten fast food, you've essentially gone to an environment where people serve a system. It has benefits, it has costs. Characteristically, in systems like that, the costs are externalized. So a lot of the negative externalities are incorrectly priced. And we can have debates about these things. We don't have to be deterministic. But in a way, much of the whole civilization thing is predicated on the idea that together we can build relatively impartial systems and patterns that are, in many ways, better than us as we are individually.
We've got a question over there. While the microphone's making its way over, just going to bring in Steve as well on that point. I mean, do you agree that actually having systems that are better than us is actually...
Well, look, I mean, I was thinking as you were talking about this, one recalls in the 1970s in Chile, cybersyn, which there is, in a way, there's a kind of mythology surrounding it, but the idea was that there was actually this kind of central computer that could take in all of the information coming in with regard, economic welfare information, and process it according to certain algorithms, right? And then, as it were, deliver what the policy recommendations are to keep the society in action. And that was that the room where this machine was held was bombed when Pinochet did his coup. But nevertheless, that is an example, and there was always that aspiration, certainly within socialism, that it might be possible to have a kind of, understand society as this entirely integrated system where you get all the inputs coming in and they're all given their due, right? So that you can even find out what's happening in the hinterlands and stuff like this. So you're not subject to the vagaries of the way in which law and policy tends to be administered depending on what region you're in, right? You'd actually have equal input into the governance structure. So that was always that was one of the reasons why cybernetics and systems theory was very attractive to socialism in the middle of the 20th century.
Interesting.
I think that's a really interesting point. How do we decide what's important, and how do we tell computers what is important? Because I think that's something that robots are really going to struggle with, is learning what is good for humans and what is important for humans. We have that struggle when we try and outsource work to different cultures, and even within humankind, we struggle to understand each other. So I think that's something that we're going to need to think about, is how are we going to teach robots what it means to be human when they can't understand things. They don't know what it's like to taste an ice cream, for example, or to have human contact and touch somebody else's skin. How are we going to teach robots to be human, or to serve humans in the best way possible?
Does anyone have any thoughts on how we're meant to be having that conversation as a society? Given that, perhaps Judy will disagree, but given that everyone seems to be telling us this revolution is around the corner, do we feel that we've got enough input into this question? Do we feel that as the British public, we're in a position to tell the UK government what sort of regulations and policies it should be bringing in place? to help us address these questions?
I think that's quite an interesting one in that we're going to end up telling the robots what is important. We can tell the robots, okay, I want to weight this in a certain way, this factor is more important than another. But that has another societal consequence in that you can then end up with lobby groups who are trying to persuade the government to weight an area in their favour. So you may end up with different issues. It may not be just as simple.
Well, this was one of the things for why it was attractive to socialists, was to prevent this kind of interest-based kind of politicking, which was so endemic in democratic societies, right?
We're rapidly approaching the end. What I'm going to do is ask for a few more questions and comments. I'm not going to expect the panel to be able to get through all of them, but if you've got a burning question you're wanting to get through all night, then now's your chance. I'm going to give the panel opportunity to try and get through as much of them as possible at the end.
Hi there. So we just talked about kind of systems as a kind of force for good within society. My question is about systems as a force for kind of bad or for evil. So you've seen kind of the mechanization of warfare and kind of what that can mean. So I think, are we being optimistic in always thinking that systems are a force for good?
Anyone else there?
We were talking about robots, sort of interacting with humans on a sort of daily basis in terms of care and stuff. But at the start, you talked more about the data side of things. I mean, a large part of sort of human nature is pattern recognition and that sort of thing. And that's something that robots are getting increasingly more, good at. And that's a large sector of jobs which disappear in terms of, police doing sort of, say, crime pattern recognition. How do you think that we can do you think this is an emerging problem, and how can we sort of deal with it, let's say?
Hello. Sort of going back to the very, very, very first point, which was, this entire conversation has pretty much been predicated on the assumption that fewer jobs is a bad thing. My question is, are we too far gone as a society to imagine a world where there are no or very, very few jobs done by humans, we have a great amount of leisure time and universal basic income, which we haven't actually touched on? Is it too late for us? Are we too wedded to this Protestant work ethic idea that social value comes from doing a good job?
There was a comment that came in via Twitter that didn't quite get around to, but this idea that given we know how important work is to our well-being and our welfare, you look at the impact of youth unemployment, part of the reason it's so deleterious is that it puts people out of work at a very formative time in their lives. And if you have that situation for everyone, what's that going to mean for human society? So that's a very interesting one. Hopefully we'll get time to touch upon that. Okay, we've got one final one at the front here, and then we're going to go back to our panel for a bit of a roundup.
Well, I think when we're talking about jobs, we are only talking about half of the issue, because the real question is productivity. And this came up in the budget today. The risk is that we're not productive as a society. We might create lots of jobs, but if those jobs are not productive, then we won't be able to support ourselves in the way that we would like to maintain our well-being. And what robots do is they increase human productivity. And if you look at even the most automated factories in the world, for instance, Tesla Motors, where they build the electric cars, there's lots of people working there alongside robots. And I think what's been great for me today is people talking about systems, because I think that's what the future is going to be. It's going to be about systems of people and machines working together in a more productive way. So that's not a comment rather than a question.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a whole range of stuff there. We've got bad systems, bad robots, the impact of AI in warfare, and is it realistic to think, given how technology's been used in war in the past, we'd have any control over trying to limit it in the future? We've got pattern recognition and the kind of things that robots will be able to do in future that they haven't done so far. Fewer jobs, is that a bad thing? Can we get on to minimum universal entitlement, and then the question about productivity as well. So I'm going to give each of the panel members a kind of a 1 minute, perhaps 90-second opportunity to pick one of those, and wrap up their thoughts for the evening. You're organised. Okay, I'm going to start that then. No.
Productivity in jobs is a separate discussion, and we need to think about them differently, and that's where something like a basic income comes in. Now, I'm not selling a basic income on the basis that we're going to end up in that sort of Keynesian dream of the leisure class. Actually, it is a way of adapting. The jobs that I do want to see eliminated are the bad jobs. The job that people are forced to do, the 0 hours contracts, and where they turn up, they're told whether they got any hours work that day or not, and they're forced to go there often by the welfare system. So we need a different relationship between welfare and work anyway. But in a context of transition through technological change, it just gives people a bit of a fighting chance to adapt to something new. I don't think it should be sold as a utopian policy. It's a help, but it's just the beginning of a help.
And I'll take the military one, and thank you for that. I mean, in my utopia, we would take all the research and development money that goes into the military and put it into green energy, for example. One would find that green energy would actually create an awful lot of jobs compared to nuclear energy. We would reorient absolutely the kind of technology we make. At the moment, a lot of the technology that we love and we see in all these silly robots from Boston Dynamics that climb stairs and things, they are all military technology. That's what they're designed for, and we're getting commercial secondary technology built out of that. So I think if we redesigned our priorities, we might create heaps of jobs.
Maggie?
Well, I think, we should try and encourage certainly the AI researchers and, in fact, the commercial firms using it, though that's going to be much more difficult, to try and design systems where there's a partnership between the AI part of the system and some human beings working with it. The human beings are doing things that they can do, which hopefully they enjoy doing, and which the AI systems can't do. The trouble is, of course, if the basic economic motivation is to save money on paying people wages, which at the moment it is, there's not a great deal of incentive for doing that. But if we could move that way, it would be very healthy, I think.
We're talking about good systems and bad systems, and I want to link that to the point about what's good for humans, to which I think the only realistic point is, well, which humans? Systems are not generally built by sort of platonic idealists who wish to benefit all of humanity. They have a certain sector of humans, quite possibly themselves and their bank balances. A lot of the most powerful and brilliant systems out there at the moment, although by no means all, are, you could argue, and I think sort of Judy very powerfully does, targeted at grossly underpricing your time and attention and repackaging your actions as data to be, sort of bartered away on the marketplace. That's not always true by any means, but I think we can start by saying, cui bono, as lawyers like to say, because if you speak Latin, you get paid more. And I just want to end with the observation that, to think about systems, for me, a lot of this begins with the idea that there is no such thing as a neutral system or a neutral tool. They're not just things that we use well or badly. They are, however complex, they make certain behaviours and outcomes more likely and easier, and other things less likely and less easier. If I want to kill you, this is not as good as a gun. And I think to get far more sophisticated about the biases baked into our systems, and to, yes, emphasise the design stage, because once we set something automated in motion, and the process of iteration, embedding, and technological momentum begins, we can be in a state of perpetual belatedness. And with much of this, we cannot afford to be belated.
Steve, final word.
I know no one wants to hear anything good about the military, but one of the reasons why the military has been so instrumental not only in the development of AI, but in the development of science and technology more generally, is because of the kinds of intellectual tasks that are involved. Actually, really stretch, as it were, the human cognitive capacity, right? So I think that, in a sense, that's and of course the actual practical urgency of what a military situation demands, adds the incentive to actually, as it were, look at the sort of pushing the limits, as it were, of how human beings can act under a wide variety of circumstances. So I think, that needs to always be taken into account. I mean, so it's not just merely that, the military is sinister and so forth and shouldn't be funding this stuff, but there is a sense in which the kinds of tasks that the military is interested in actually does stretch the imagination in the relevant ways that start to make AI comparable to the full range of human capacities. That would be Now, the gentleman over here who brought up the business about the pattern recognition powers of computers and the fact that we have all this big data stuff, I think that does open up a really interesting and very important problem on the horizon for human beings. And this is kind of the, the pre-crime scenarios, right? The idea that, as these machines get access to all kinds of data about people generally, right, just as we're now beginning, to preemptively diagnose people with stuff, right, because they have, as it were, certain kinds of correlated symptoms and so forth, even before they actually have any kind of disease. The same thing, of course, can happen with regard to the criminal system as well. And I think that is something to worry about with regard to how artificial intelligence could be used to subjugate people, to remove habeas corpus even, and so forth, right? So a lot of the kind of legal rights and that we have as human beings in modern society could be eroded very much by this. So that's something to watch out for. And finally, with regard to the systems approach that was being brought up about robots and human beings and how they're going to be more tightly knitted together and how work is going to have much more of that character, I think the thing that's going to be on the horizon for that, especially as the machines get more and more intelligent, is the issue of assigning responsibility when things go wrong. Okay? And whether we might want to start to think about, under what circumstances, would we have not only Android rights, but Android responsibilities with regard to these things, especially if we are imagining a world where human beings and robots are going to be working more intimately together.
That's a great point to end on. That is, unfortunately, all we've got time for this evening. I feel like we've spent, this event was meant to be about robots and AI, and we've spent more time talking about humans and human intelligence. And I can't decide if that's kind of healthy and empowering and wonderful, or incredibly shallow and narcissistic and inevitable. I'll leave that to you to ponder. Can you join me in saying a few thanks? Firstly, to our fabulous panel, Maggie Bowden, Tom Chatfield, Steve Fuller, Anthony Painter, and Judy Wiseman. Can I also get a quick round of thanks to all the staff here at the Cavendish Centre and at the British Science Association who haven't had their job stolen yet and are still working to create fabulous events like these. Do check out the website, britishscienceweek.org, and I hope you find something that's interesting. And finally, thank you all for coming and participating and being an absolutely fabulous audience. Thank you.